Welcome back to Neoliberalism, where today we have a returning guest, Matthew Downhour, and hopefully we're going to talk about Canada and why we should conquer it. Excuse me, no, I'm sorry, I have that backwards.
Or
Why we
shouldn't.
shouldn't conquer Canada. I'm still a little taken aback because this isn't really something that came up at all during the campaign or the election, but ever since, Donald Trump has pivoted pretty hard to the suggestion that we should conquer Canada or possibly Greenland or Mexico or Panama. So this seems to, on some level, it feels like it's come out of nowhere. It seems a level of insane that's kind of hard to comprehend, but we're going to try and comprehend it a little bit this week. And some people have responded to these events by saying, well, this represents a fundamental break of the liberal international order, that this is going to shatter it, or it has shattered it already. So I guess our question this week is, what is the liberal international order? And why is it worth upholding or not, as the case may be? So yeah, does anyone want to take a swing at that one? What is the liberal international order?
Yeah, I mean, I think from one perspective, or one of the crucial questions, and in this sense, this abandonment of the liberal international order is not, coming out of the blue. The idea that countries working together can be a positive sum game. There are gains to be had through cooperation, and someone else's gain is not necessarily your loss. Well, that's maybe the foundational. There's a lot of like the rules-based order, or free trade order, or whatever, but that's kind of the belief that undergirds the whole thing, is that we're not in constant competition with other states, and we're seeking more than just power. We're seeking prosperity or freedom or something else that we could all have more of. And in that sense, I would say a theme of Trump's, but all three of Trump's campaigns has been that that's not the world we live in, that our gains can only come at somebody else's expense. And to some extent, this belligerence is an extension of that sort of shift in worldview that apparently we bought into here.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, certainly we saw the last time that Trump was in office a real resentment of other Western nations, resentment of the international order, right? He was arguing that America was getting taken advantage of by our allies, right? That they weren't paying their way in NATO or in other defensive alliances, and that if they didn't raise their own domestic military spending, then we would have to pull out of defending them. He's argued that we should be paid more in some cases, paid more for the military bases we maintain on other nations' territory. And so you're right that this is not exactly new. This sense that the world is a zero-sum world, and if someone else is benefiting, we must be losing. So that's certainly a longstanding theme of, his foreign policy, but also just his personality generally.
Yeah. And so we're seeing, and so you talk about, so what does that mean when we had a liberal world order, or if we had a liberal world order, what was it? And I don't know, to me, it seems like there's certain rules that we often, perhaps they were breached, but they were really sort of understood as rules. And one was, as you implied, we give up on conquest, right? We've put that in the past of us. We're not conquering and annexing new territory. One of the justifications for the Gulf War was, if we really slap Saddam down here and we say, no, you're not annexing Kuwait, we'll set a norm. And whatever else came out of the Gulf War, a lot of people, I think, felt that norm was pretty well established, that, countries just don't do that to one another. So that would be, I think, one of the rules or things that we've established here that guaranteed at least a liberal world order, a world order where liberalism could exist and could kind of have a shot. But it does seem like that has been, crumbling a little bit, and Trump seems to just want to toss it out the window in sort of an active way, even if it doesn't have an obvious benefit for us.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a this rule, like if there is any rule at all to the liberal order, it's no conquest. I would say it's rule number one, but that's not even a metaphor, right? If you look, this document we'll probably come back to later in the podcast, the Atlantic Charter. It does have a list of rules, and the first one is no conquering your neighbors, which is important. And I think it's also interesting to see this in light of other recent events that suggest that the liberal international order is facing a kind of a crisis that goes beyond just the person of Donald John Trump. I mean, probably the most visible crisis these days is the crisis in Ukraine, where Putin, Russia, has just made it very explicit. We're going to conquer our neighbor. We're going to conquer them. We're going to annex them. We're going to make them incorporate them into part of our territory. And that war has been going on for years now, arguably for many years since it began with the annexation of Crimea, I believe in 2014. Right. And the liberal international order, I mean, we've supported Ukraine, but fundamentally we haven't stopped Russia, right? They still occupy large parts of Ukraine.
You know, Samantha, you're fond of talking about the importance of narrative. And of course, one way that Putin has sought to sort of finesse this is to, you know, appeal to the history of the longer term history and say Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. If you go way back, there's this, you know, he appeals to these really ancient times of Kiev and Rus and all this stuff, you know, trying to say, oh, really, but really, we're not breaking down the international order here. We're not annexing something that shouldn't be part of Russia to begin with, right? So there's this dream of the Atlantic Charter. We're going to fix the borders once and for all. And anybody who's not happy with that, but who acknowledges the sort of force of the Atlantic Charter, you know, is going to sort of try to undermine that and say, well, those borders are the wrong borders or something like that.
Yeah, certainly that sort of gets to the role of nationalism and the role of nations in kind of being the component parts of the liberal international order, and why these have always been kind of tricky, right? On some level, the liberal international order, I would argue, has got three core like there's a promise, right? There's a promise. If you join the liberal international order and you follow the rules, then you will be safe and you will be rich and you will be free. And those three things together are like the core promise of this order. But I think to try and understand why that promise is so attractive and what the trouble with nations is, the trouble with nations, big topic right there. Maybe also see if we can talk a little bit about the history of the liberal international order. Because kind of to understand it, I think we have to understand where it came from and what the alternatives are. And so we've talked about the Atlantic Charter. Charter is signed, gosh, it's not 1945, it's earlier than 1945.
It's earlier. Yeah, the interesting about the Atlantic Charter is, I believe it's 1941, because it's almost, I mean, the U.S. hasn't yet joined the war at this point, right? It's like, I think they're on an aircraft carrier, Roosevelt and Churchill. And it's almost it is a huge acquiescence by the United Kingdom that, like, they're going to accept the way that Roosevelt essentially wants the world to be after the war. It's sort of a preemptive 14 points, right? You'll recall Wilson, you know, shows up to Versailles with his 14 points, and the rest of Europe says, like, okay, well, the war's over, and also you only popped in for the last few months of it, so you can't tell us how the world's going to look. Roosevelt really comes in and tries to avoid that problem by getting in writing, like, here's our vision of the world, even before we're going to enter in and support the UK. And I like your idea of these three promises, because I think in the biggest sense, maybe the most obvious one, those are sort of the promises we hand out to Germany and Japan, right? Like, hey, you tried being revisionist powers by force, you lost, but we don't want to, play this out again and again and again. Here's the promise, right? You're going to be safe and you're going to be prosperous and you'll be free, although maybe not fully sovereign, if you buy into this alternative. So you not only get the allies with the Atlantic Charter, but then your enemies sign on as well, so that at least outside the Soviet Union and its sphere, you have kind of a set upon agreed to principles.
Yeah, I think the history of the Atlantic Charter is really fascinating, like you say, because it's signed in 41. It's signed before America enters the war. And it's interesting because it's a document that does not have any enforcement clauses, right? There's no penalties. It doesn't even create an organization to monitor it. It's just a statement of principles. It's not a long document. I mean, if you're listening to this, I recommend looking it up. It's only one page. There's only 8 points. And the points are, let's see, number one, their countries seek no aggrandizement, territorial or other. Numbers 2 and 3 are about national self-determination. Number 4 is free trade and, access on equal terms to the trade and the raw materials of the world, which are needed for their economic prosperity. 5 is more economic development stuff. 6, more national sovereignty. 7, more free trade. And 8 is, again, no more war, basically. So a little bit of repetition in there.
I like how you point that out, though. 4 is free trade, and that is germane to the document, because what I think Roosevelt is trying to do there is undercut the logic of imperialism, right? As they specifically mentioned raw materials there. How do we make imperialism not make sense anymore? Well, if everybody has, on a free trade basis, the access to the products and materials of the world, the impetus for going out and seizing those is, as had been done the previous 100 years, is substantially less, and more than 100 years, I suppose. And given the immense expense involved in imperialism, that's something else that countries are likely to sign on to, right? If everyone agrees they have more equal access to these things, it becomes more trouble than it's worth to go out and conquer territory, at least territory that's far from you, to try to get a hold of the coal or the rubber or whatever, because you can simply buy it if you want it badly.
No, I think that's exactly right. The free trade line, especially, is meant to undercut the logic of imperialism, and this kind of gets to why this document, which seems kind of simple, seems kind of maybe bland to us, basically gave Winston Churchill a nervous breakdown, right? It was an immense agony for him to sign this thing, again, despite knowing it had no enforcement clauses, despite the fact that America doesn't even join the war, right? We're not even extracting an alliance, or he's not even extracting an alliance from us in return for signing this thing. But he knows that by signing it, he is giving away the world. He's giving away the future, as he sees it, right? Because Winston Churchill is just basically a hardcore British imperialist. What is he like? You look at the span of his life, and what has he dedicated his life to? It's the British Empire. He fights in a lot of places before World War One, before World War Two, before World War One. Even he fights in a lot of places defending the empire. We went off to do that specifically, and I think this is kind of the world before the World Wars is a world of empires. Famously, the sun never sets on the British Empire. They own a quarter of the world's landmass, third of its people. They're not the only empire out there. The French Empire, they have an enormous set of overseas holdings, and there is this economic picture of the world that they're all attached to, right? Where the colonies are going to be these sources of raw materials. They're going to ship them back to the metropole, which is going to do industry to them, and then sell those finished goods, basically the industrial products, back to the colonies, right? And this is supposedly going to make the metropole rich and powerful and safe and glorious. Right? And this, as you kind of hinted at, this is the same kind of logic that the revisionist powers of World War II are interested in.
Right. I mean, the co-prosperity sphere, right, is a very concrete. I mean, they're using the words, right? Although it uses the language of cooperation. Japan is very open that we need an empire for raw materials, right? Which is ironic, I guess, when you consider in the post-war world, Japan has more ability than anybody to purchase raw materials at much less expense than what they're putting into occupying Korea or occupying Manchuria.
No, I think that's exactly right. Adam Tooze talks a little bit about this. Not Adam Tooze, although The Wages of Destruction is a great book. No, in Blood and Ruins, Richard Overy talks about the imperial logic of Japan and Germany. That it's not just that they went to war because they liked war, but they were both quite explicit about how, well, we're small countries, and if we look out at the world and we see the great countries, France and Britain, what have they got? They've got empires, right? What has America got? An empire, on the Great Plains, right? They kind of see America with this kind of imperial logic. We can talk about that. And they think, well, what do we need to be great nations? We need our own colonies. And where are we going to get them? For Japan, it's China, it's Korea, it's Southeast Asia. And for Germany, it's Eastern Europe, right? Hitler is pretty explicit. Well, what we're going to do in Eastern Europe is what America did on the Great Plains. We are going to kill every single person there. And everyone we don't kill, we're going to enslave. And then afterwards, we'll be rich and prosperous, just like America. Right, you can see actually the same bizarre logic is present in Mussolini, who has these crazy stories about how like the Italian peasant is going to go out and like start a homestead in Ethiopia and increase the productivity of the land 100 times, and none of that ever happens.
Which is not altogether different though from the stories the British are telling about what they're going to do in South Africa and Australia, right? Like it is, yeah, a lot of this was things. They're versions of things that were happening with imperialism, even from the the ostensible democracies, right? Were settler colonialism, the Republic of France, or the parliamentary state of England or Britain. This is certainly not limited to the fascist or even the authoritarian powers, right? This idea that what we've got is this capacity to go out and make the desert bloom, but only we can do it, and so you have to let us do it, right? And then that's also going to benefit the people back home in this sort of, like you said, imperial logic.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what I kind of want to emphasize here is the extent to which the world before the liberal international order is characterized by the logic of empire. And it has been characterized by the logic of empire for centuries, right? This is not a particularly new idea, right? But nations for hundreds, arguably thousands of years, they think, well, what do we do to become rich? Well, there's some people over there, and we're going to get all our guys together and go over there with a bunch of swords, and we're going to kill them. And then afterwards, we'll have all their stuff, or, we're going to just take their land, or their descendants will pay us tribute, right? There are various kinds of ways you can structure the imperial relationship, right? But this image of national greatness as coming from war and from extraction is the international order of the world for a very long time.
And in the pre-industrial era, the land means productivity. It's agriculture. It's food. That's what you're going to aim to extract a lot of, right? So the emphasis on land, there is a logic to that. In a pre-industrial time that today it's like land, what's the big deal? Like back then land was, it was a big deal. If it was good farmland, it was a big deal.
Exactly. In the pre-industrial era, you could also plunder a great deal, right? Nowadays it's harder to steal a factory. It can sort of be done. But yeah, before the Industrial Revolution, most or much of the wealth was stuff that you could quite literally carry off. That logic really did hold. It would have been very difficult in the pre-industrial era to make something like this stick because the stuff it's just sitting right there. I can go take it. One of the transitions is it's much harder to go and plunder, and so the potential benefits of sticking to a hopefully positive sum trade interaction become much more attractive as a result. So yeah, there's a kind of a technological and economic shift that we like to hope suits a sustained liberal world order, although it doesn't guarantee it.
No, I think that's exactly right. You can see this argument has been made by Brett Devereaux on his blog, collection of unmitigated pedantry. You can also, I believe, see it in Azar Gatt's War in Human Civilization. But basically, that the logic of empire makes sense in a mostly agricultural world, a world of no real growth, where the wealth is in like land, which you can take, or people, which you can take as slaves, or gold, which you can just take, right? And that the changes of the modern world are that the returns to conquest start becoming abysmal, right? That there's nothing you could possibly gain from a war that would be worth the unbelievable human and industrial and economic costs of fighting a war, that even fighting a war ruins the thing that you were trying to get, because it's not land, it's this complicated system of economic production that's enormously productive and ever growing as long as you just kind of let it. But it's also worth noting, this part's important, is that people knew this, but people knew this before World War One, right? There's this book, The Great Illusion, which basically argues that war is obsolete, right? That you can just, why would you go to war? You don't need war for natural resources. You can just buy stuff, and it's much cheaper and easier for all concerned. But then we have World War One anyways, right? And then we have World War Two right after.
War, yeah.
Right? So that the economic logic is one thing, but it's a deliberate act of, international policy to create this thing when we can actually start realizing these positive sum gains.
Could it be that there were leaders who didn't understand economics?
Indeed, I think you're right. I think you do see, Hitler expected, at least in the longer term, economic gain, which was not, even if he had been more successful, not realistic, right? The idea that Hitler was going to somehow create a Reich that matched Germany today, or Germany even in the 60s, right? Is he probably couldn't have, and he likely didn't know that. But also, I think since World War I and World War II happened, and they're so obviously, to an economist anyway, economically unjustifiable, you get kind of a different explanation. That is sort of where you get the realist school comes into being, which doesn't necessarily say, yeah, it's an imperial economic logic, but rather puts a lot of emphasis on this idea of security, right? And that essentially wars happen or nations militarize because they can't guarantee their own security without doing so. And because no state can trust another, the only way to have security is to build up your own power. And if you see security as the new currency, right, that's the new thing that every state wants, that more or less is zero sum, or at least it's very difficult from a realist perspective to make one country more secure without making its neighbors less secure. And so even after the Atlantic Charter and even after World War II is over, that is sort of I would say, kind of the intellectual clash, right? Do we live in a liberal world order where we can all be more secure together? Or is it this sort of realist world where, it's relatively peaceful because we have our security, and this comes at the expense of everybody else not having their security, or just sort of trusting that we won't attack them, trusting sometimes in an unjustified way that we won't attack them.
Yeah, so I think, I'm not particular. I think it's important to understand realist logic and see that there are cases where it clearly explains the behavior of states. I think the post-war order is something that this kind of realist logic has a hard time explaining. In particular, the extent to which, basically the liberal promises, they worked really well in Western Europe, right? Western Europe, today we think of it as like this charming, peaceful, sedate kind of a continent, but you look at European history before 1945 and it is a bloody history, right? They were going to war with each other constantly for centuries, right? There are these various kinds of ancient national rivalries, ancient security dilemmas that no one seems to be able to get out of, like apocalyptic wars that they fought with each other. 1945 comes down, and like you say, the pitch of America is, well, we're going to rebuild everybody, right? France is getting rebuilt, Germany's getting rebuilt, Italy's getting rebuilt, everybody gets rebuilt, and you're all going to be, and you don't need to prepare for war with each other because you're all going to be so busy getting rich, trading with each other, and it works, right? France and Germany today functionally do not act as if they have any security concern at all from each other, which is kind of an amazing change, considering that they were like two of the primary belligerents in both World War I and World War II. Right, so I think there are cases where it seems like the liberal promises have worked really well.
Your voice almost indicates there's cases where it has worked well. The implication, there's cases where it hasn't, right? And it works well in the countries to which the U.S. kind of extends the promise, right? And I think you do see a shift it seems like, at least, as you mentioned, Roosevelt in the Atlantic Charter puts a lot in there about self-determination, has a vision of empires really ending, and works to do that in the U.S. itself with the Philippines. But after Roosevelt's death, the U.S. is maybe not entirely dedicated to that vision in a universal sense. And certainly, to some extent, Truman interrupts that vision, and to an arguably even greater extent, Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers and the U.S. security apparatus that comes in after sort of Roosevelt's idealism sees this as, I would say, probably a limited promise, or a promise with that not everybody can cash in on.
Yeah, I think that's right. So there are certainly, like I said, there's some very important cases where the liberal promises really deliver. Right? Western Europe is an obvious one. Japan is a very important one. Takes a little bit longer, but South Korea, Taiwan, both really cash in on these liberal promises. Singapore. You could also talk about Eastern Europe after 1989, after the implosion of the communist world. The liberal promises have worked really well for most of the countries of Eastern Europe, right? That Poland kind of famously has seen tremendous economic growth since the fall of communism, since they basically just adopt the entire slate of Western institutions, and it's worked out for them. There are a lot of other countries where maybe the promises are not working so great, and where, that expose in some ways the failures and the hypocrisies of the liberal order.
And to an extent, you see where the compromise in one of the points, particularly the first point, right, the no aggrandizement, throws the whole rest of the thing into disarray. You can look especially at Israel and its relation with its neighbors. There's been some aggrandizement, territorial and otherwise, and what you see is that that has led to, we're going on 80 years now of that never really settles down. Carter tries to sort of paper it over with Camp David and manages to get peace with Egypt, but in much of the region, we see the immediate conflict between when a state is trying to grow by aggrandizement or by conquest. You can't get the rest of the liberal world order, right? You can't get free trade between Israel and its neighbors because they're, in many cases, technically at war. And in many others, the popular sentiment is so hostile, right? You're not going to get the kind of positive some interactions that we would like to see. And that's been going on since, arguably, right, the very beginning of what we tried to establish the liberal world order also ushers in a new set of challenges in the Middle East, especially because not everyone is experiencing those promises as a liberal.
No, I think that's right. I think you can frame this in terms of territorial aggrandizement. You can also frame it in terms of the problems that were continually encountered with this idea of national self-determination, where, like you said, you mentioned earlier Wilson, his 14 points. He was also big on national self-determination. They're trying to draw up the borders of Europe after World War I. And Wilson is like, well, it's obvious. We just draw the borders where the people are. And it'll be all Hungarians on one side of the border, and all Austrians on the other side of the border, and all Serbs on the other side of the border, and all Croats on the other side of the border. And it's easy, right? They all live in such nicely geographically delimited areas. And they send a bunch of demographers out into Eastern Europe, and in the Balkans, immediately discover what should have been obvious, which is that people don't live so neatly separated, right? Nation states like to portray themselves as kind of like these ethnically homogenous units, or they used to, and that was just never true in terms of the realities on the ground. And so this was always the big question, in terms of national self-determination, as well, whose nation gets to determine it when it's a little bit uncertain.
And of course, there's explicit exceptions, right? From at very beginning, France and England say, yeah, national self-determination, we will buy into that for other people's countries that are not our empires. But of course, there's not going to be Syrian self-determination. Of course, there's not going to be Indian self-determination. That's sort of written off as absurd with the original 14 points, right? That's not going to apply to all of those people. And then, as you say, it doesn't apply particularly well in Europe. It's not really, or it's a dream, it's a vision that fundamentally requires an ethnic cleansing, right? And that's essentially what happens with Greece and Turkey. After World War II, that's largely what happens is you adopt a new ethnicity or you move to a place that matches it. But it's not at all a peaceful process, right? We get to the Europe that we have, which is mostly composed of nation states, although freedom of movement has kind of shaken that up a little bit and created another more cosmopolitan continent. But it didn't get there in a peaceful way, and probably not in a way that we want to imitate anywhere else in the world, right? We wouldn't want to do that again, do all the things that it took to get Europe, to the sort of nation states that we know it.
No, I think that's exactly right. Obviously, there's enormous amounts of ethnic cleansing that go on. Ethnic cleansing, I mean, that's like murder, right? Enormous amounts of murder and forced population transfer that happened prior to World War II, during World War II, and what kind of gets forgotten is after World War II as well.
Right.
That the winners just say, okay, we have the largest armies the world has ever seen. You are getting on a train and moving, and millions upon millions of people are just moved from one part of Europe to another in order to create these more ethnically homogenous states. But then, of course, it never lasts, right? And it's never complete. And so part of the idea of the liberal order, right, is that you're going to have what they used to call protection for national minorities or the rights of national minorities. And these days we just call like human rights or civil rights, right? That you might be an ethnically mostly one kind of nation, but like all the minorities, like we're going to have certain kinds of fair legal protections. And the willingness to compromise on that plank in particular and that promise in particular has been one of the great hypocrisies, one of the great failures of the liberal order. And like you say,
we often see it as a bonus, right? The meat and potatoes are a stable nation at peace with its neighbors, with free trade, and the human rights are like dessert. That'd be a nice thing, but it's it comes afterwards or it's a bonus. Like as you're pointing out, absent a massive population transfer and forcible relocation of people, it's not a bonus. It's an absolutely necessary part of the whole system working in the long term. Otherwise, you have this at its root. It's built on a lie, right? You've created an entity that you say is for Germans, but it doesn't have only Germans or it doesn't have all the Germans. It's not going to live up to what it says it is, and that tension is always going to be a problem there, unless it can say, this is the entity called Germany, but other people can be welcome and respected. And yeah, as you say, we've compromised on that, and arguably to the detriment of a lot of the rest of the world. This has meant that the liberal order sort of ring hollow, or the stability that we said would come with it has not come.
I think it's kind of interesting because you can see people dissatisfied with this in both respects. Right, people who are national minorities, they're like, well, you, the liberal order, you're cooperating with the people who are oppressing us, right? You shaking hands with oppressive dictators and, ethnocratic assholes and telling us that they're members in good standing of the liberal order, but they're clearly violating human rights left and right. On the other hand, you can also see people who are dissatisfied with the liberal order because they're like, who are you fucking Westerners to tell us how we run our country, right? I mean, this is kind of if you look at China's global civilization initiative, I believe I have that correct. One of the planks of which is their kind of like pitch for an alternative world order, one of the planks is what they call, unconditional or absolute national sovereignty, which in practice means that no one's going to criticize you for human rights abuses. Right, no one's going to keep on lecturing you about the forced labor camps in Xinjiang. No one's going to...
The answer to Western hypocrisy is to just not talk about it. You can't be hypocritical if you never criticize, right? And so then we've got no hypocrites here. Everyone's just doing what they
will say. Well,
they say they're going to do.
You Westerners are such hypocrites. You're talking about national right or human rights. You're talking about equality, but like your own history is built on blood. You already did all of your own massacring and your own ethnic cleansing and your own drawing the borders to suit you. And now that you've done it, you're talking about the rights of national minorities. And we just want what you've got, right?
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
I think.
What do we do about it? I mean, what's that? that is, the fundamental question, right? Can you leapfrog that? That's the dream, right? We leapfrog that whole era of Europe and of the U.S., where you're forcibly creating homogeneity, and can you build a non-nation state, or can you build a society that maybe looks like a nation state but skips all of that and moves straight into the liberal order? That I think that's the kind of the question, right? Is that possible? Sounds like what China's saying is no, right? Stop trying to make us do a thing you yourself didn't do. What Russia is saying is, maybe for you, but our civilization is different, right? We need to have the rights to do what we do civilizationally, and that whether you like it or not.
And certainly you've seen people, I mean, right, you've seen people on the Israeli right make the same argument, right? That we're just trying to do what everybody else has already done. We're just late to the game. And we're very sorry, but this requires us to displace, millions and millions of people, right? So yes, you can see the right wing around the world kind of making this argument against the liberal international order, accusing it of hypocrisy in some ways.
So would you say that that is contributing to, or that what Trump is doing now, which is basically just in this, I mean, who knows to what extent he has plans or concepts of a plan to back up what he's saying, but rhetorically, trying to wipe all of these agreements off the map, right? Just say like we are held by none of this. Would you see that as somewhat an extension of what's already been happening, or the failures that we've already seen with this sort of liberal promise?
Well, you have, two aspects. You have his internal policy, and then you have, as Samantha described so well at the beginning, his brand new, as of 6 weeks ago, policy of wanting to take over Canada and Greenland and Panama, right? And, obviously his internal policy of, proposed policy of mass deportation speaks to what you guys were all just discussing. But this other policy of apparently, wanting to engage in territorial aggrandizement, two huge words, that to me harkens back to this idea of leaders who don't understand economics, right? Like people have, I don't know how much they're joking, but they literally have suggested that Trump likes how big Greenland looks on the Mercator projection, and that is a profoundly unsophisticated, unintelligent, unwise way of conducting your foreign policy that sort of harks back to this idea of not understanding that we're in an industrial world and not a pre-industrial world, right?
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, just to say it very explicitly, there's nothing we could possibly get from Greenland in a war that we could not get more easily from free trade, right? Oh no, Greenland, like, there's not really a lot in Greenland. I don't know if you know this, but there's not really a lot there. Maybe there's some deposits of like rare earth metals. I don't know. I've seen that bandied around. But if there are deposits of rare earth metals in Greenland and you want to use them in your domestic industry, the easiest thing to do is just pay people. And it works really well. You can just buy the stuff.
Am I right in my recollection that there's like 60,000 people there?
That sounds about right. There's not a lot of people there.
Yeah.
More people in the Indianapolis suburb that I grew up in.
Right. So there's not a lot of people in Greenland. The Panama Canal. Yes, it's a very important trade route. It's very important, if you want to think about these things this way, militarily and allowing passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific. But functionally, we can already use the Panama Canal. We just have to pay Panama a little bit when we transit through it, right?
And here's the logic, right? The logic is, if you own it, you can deny it to other people. And that's where we get to the imperial logic, right? Obviously, from an economic perspective, if we can all agree that we should all be just buying things on the market, buying passage to the canal, we can all share it, obviously. But like you said, that's not the logic of imperialism, right? And part of the logic of imperialism is not just that I can get it, but that I can keep you from it. And that's where, even if Trump doesn't do any of these things, and the process by which you accomplish any of them is clear, by saying it, by stating it, by declaring it, and as you said, Jason, in a way he never did in the elections, there's not really any strong reason to believe that he has a mandate for this, right? Or that anybody really bought into this ahead of time. But it does seem like, at the very least, by rhetorically declaring this desire, he is just entirely severing the U.S. from any of those liberal promises, right? We don't offer you safety even from us, right? We don't offer prosperity. We'll ruin our economy and yours, right? And we certainly don't offer freedom because we're going to make you answer to us. And even if he can't do it, he can essentially withdraw that promise, right? But if you're following an imperial logic, that itself is an accomplishment, right? He's made the world more like the way that he sees it, or somebody behind him sees it.
Or maybe the way he hopes the American people see it. And another possible explanation for what he's up to with all this stuff is that it's a distraction. The classic, plenty of people have argued that war makes politicians popular, right? That may or may not be true in the long run. In the short run, I think it often is true. And for an administration that seems to be bent on plunder, and I don't mean plunder abroad. I mean running scams and enriching Donald Trump. If that's what you want, massive distractions are great for you. A country obsessed with the latest belligerent actions against Mexican cartels or whatever it may be. Is a country that's it pushes the investigative journalism off page one, so to speak. If I can use a metaphor for newspapers, which is a thing that used to exist in the past, how people got information, right? But anything that gets people away from thinking about how Donald Trump and his cronies are ripping them off, and just gets them like bound up in war news, obviously that was potentially good for him in that way, right? So maybe he's doing grand thoughts about pre-industrial mindset strategies of imperialism, or maybe he's just he's got those private calls with Vladimir Putin, and nobody knows what he talks about, and maybe Putin's saying a big war is great for helping people pay no attention to how you're robbing them.
Yeah, and this is something that you'll often find me saying is like, okay, the Third Reich is so strange. We compare a lot of things to Hitler, but it's rarely a good comparison. The Second Reich is often a pretty good comparison, and this is something that was definitely true of Wilhelmine Germany, right? Did any of their colonies pay off? Like, was there a lot to be gotten in Cameroon that Germany could effectively utilize? Probably not, but it was still immensely popular. In some sense, really just painting colors on the map, right? We commit some terrible atrocities, and then we put our flag up. And for whatever reason, and maybe it was unique to the time period, or maybe it's a deep psychological reason, but that's pretty popular, like you said, at least in the short run. In the long run, it's expensive and people don't like paying for it. But in the short run, it's popular to plant your flag places. And so part of the logic of imperialism isn't logic at all. It's this, it gets the crowd riled up, right? It gets people waving their flags. And that could be the extent of his thought process.
I think that kind of gets to something where we can describe, like you say, the logic of imperialism in this kind of dry way, but it's accompanied by people, right? It's people who do this, right? Who are acting out, who don't necessarily have some deep political, economic understanding of the world, but they have emotional responses, right? They have a mindset that says, if I want more, I have to take it from somebody else, and they're going to have less, right? The zero sum mindset that just sees everything in terms of winners and losers, in terms of hierarchy and domination. And this is arguably made sense once upon a time. It doesn't make sense, but the mindset certainly endures. It endures in leaders, in, like you say, maybe it endures in the public. People who say we're painting the colors on the map, and that must mean we're a great nation.
And I mean, that is, if you think about it, right, we like to think that, this really good book defined intellectual history and set public opinion. But I mean, how many rallies has Trump held in the last, 8 years? However long he's been holding rallies. This has been, the Greenland, the Panama thing is relatively new, but this has been his consistent messaging, right? And when Trump says it, Fox says it. And so there's a real sense, I think, in which Trump is not only following public opinion, but trying to set it, or the kind of Trump machine, the apparatus around him, is trying to change public opinion to be that mindset, right? That let's go conquer mindset, or at least that zero-sum mindset relative to the rest of the world. And, probably to some extent anyway, succeeding, right? If it's on your TV every night and you go to a big rally and you wave your flag, and in between his talks about deportation, he's talking about how other countries are taking advantage of us, or how, we're getting the worst deals. At some point, at least for some people, they're going to believe that. And it's going to move the needle on public opinion to the extent that people think about international relations at all. And probably most of them don't. Jason shaking his head.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say the people. I'm gonna say the people he's saying this to, like, what do they even know is going on in other countries? Virtually nothing, you know. So it's just a pure scapegoat. It's like if he goes up there and says we're getting a raw deal from China, most people have zero idea what kind of deal we're getting from China. You know, they see made in China on some products around their house, and that's about the extent of it. You know, so.
I think this gets back to what you mentioned earlier in terms of the importance of narrative. Something I talked about in terms of how the Atlantic Charter, the liberal international order, is kind of an act of deliberate creation, right? That these are sustained by choices people make, both leaders and ordinary people, by narratives we have about the world and what works and what doesn't, and what makes us rich and what makes us great, and what doesn't make us rich and doesn't make us great. And I think, right, Trump is obviously he's a kind of a singular character in a lot of ways, but he's also obviously was able to take root in a larger environment in which the liberal international order doesn't seem to have the legitimacy it used to, right? Personally, I think it is still the best out of the set of ideas that we have. This looks like the best one compared to the world of empires, because a world of empires is not is not a safe world. It's not a free world. It's not a prosperous world. It is a world of wars and destruction and pure loss. But I think there is a
Well, you need to be holding the rallies then. You need to go right. That it's the liberal world. Maybe what it lacks is that kind of charismatic narrative building in the public. People who go out and will say that rather than like just giving a Trump light version of the world where we're getting we are getting bad deals, but I'll get better ones than Trump will get.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a sense in which there are real problems with the order as it stands. And one of those problems is in terms of economics, right? That there's a level of free trade that works really well, but there's also clearly an extent to which countries, I mean, now I'm wandering off topic, are dissatisfied with the kind of development that they've gotten out of free trade. And this ties back into like the kind to developmentalist economies and like what it takes to make a poor country into a rich country, or what it is like what is China doing in terms of industrial policy that has turned them into the world's factory, and like is that fair, and what effects that does that have in America? And like there's a lot of unsettled questions here, I want to say, but I think you're also right that like on a fundamental level we aren't really, the American people are a little bit disillusioned with this, in part because we just maybe don't have a charismatic speaker, in part because we don't have so many great successes to look back on recently.
I say, or they don't look like successes because we've forgotten the alternative. There's always a possibility of that.
No, I think the world in general has forgotten the alternatives to the liberal international order. I think the world wars are fading into the mists of history.
And it is often commented on America itself, like that this country has rarely seen warfare on its own land area, right? But I suppose one way to remedy that would be to provoke our immediate neighbors, Canada and Mexico. So maybe that's what President-elect Trump is up to. He wants to give us an education in war on the home front.
Yeah. And with that cheery thought to end on, yeah, maybe we'll be back next week on Neoliberalism talking about the battle for Ottawa. I hope we're not talking about the battle for Ottawa. That would be truly an awful timeline to live in, but whatever comes, here on Neoliberalism, we will try to make a little sense of the world that we live in. Once again, Liberal Currents is a listener, viewer, reader supported publication. If you like the work that we're doing here, go on over to patreon.com/liberalcurrents and yeah, pitch in a little bit to help us keep producing all our content. Thank you.